So, what do you do if you think a judge is biased? Well, let's take a look at that. But what's brought this about? You may have seen that a number of lawyers have written an open letter to the Garrick Club about the fact that they only allow men as full members, or any sort of member actually. And the argument is that because a number of very senior people are there, including like members of the judiciary, the head of MI5, all that sort of thing, that basically it's a little exclusive club where things are spoken behind closed doors. And that's a dangerous situation to be in. I mean, this letter was signed by all sorts of people, sort of like sitting judges, members of the Supreme Court, senior lawyers, and some slightly lesser known legal figures. But what's the issue about bias? Well, the main test for bias of a judge is what we call Porter and McGill. And there are two elements to it. There's actual bias, and then there's appearance of bias. So what can bring that around? Well, it can be things where a judge has an interest in the outcome of the case, or a judge is related in some way to one of the parties. Now, that's not something like, say for instance, it's a row about a gas bill and a judge has a couple of British gas shares. That probably won't be enough to raise this issue. Although judges will usually, quite often comment and say, just to let you know, I do actually have some like shares in this company. Does anybody have a problem with that? But it's got to be something more than that. The mere fact that you've had encounters with a judge before, even in the same set of legal proceedings or previous legal proceedings, and they have ruled against you, even if they've done it in quite strong terms, that's not necessarily enough. But how do you go about objecting? Well, you try it with the actual judge. Now, some judges will come in and say, like, there's an issue here. Does anybody have a problem with this? Some judges will voluntarily recuse themselves. I have some connection with this case, therefore it's inappropriate for me to hear it. You can actually, though, waive that, so the parties can agree between themselves and say, look, we're quite happy, Judge, for you to carry on with this. I did it once where a judge was clearly trying to recuse himself out of a really awkward case, and I was just sat there going, no, we're fine, we're really happy. And you can see the judge going, right, okay, thank you. But it's very rare that we say, actually, Judge, you are biased. What we will usually say is the second limb, which is the appearance of bias. And the test for that is that would a reasonably minded, objective observer, knowing all the facts of the matter, would they say, not sure about this, mate, this just doesn't seem right that judge is sitting on this case. If that judge won't recuse themselves after your argument, you can obviously appeal that. But what are some of the issues? Well, do judges' politics or who judges hang around with, can that be an issue? I remember years ago there was lots of discussion about whether judges could be Freemasons, and this Garrick Club thing seems very similar to that, because it's the idea that things get sorted out behind closed doors. I can't say I don't know any friends who are members of the Garrick Club, although ironically, when I did that video the other night and plugged the book and said, oh, my friend's got this book out, when I got in, I messaged her and said, oh, I've just plugged your book, and would you mind coming on and talking? Now, she's a judge, and she actually said, she goes, I saw you were just in the pub 20 minutes ago. I was waving to you, but you completely blanked me. She still has very kindly said she will come on and talk about mental health tribunals, though. But there was a case, remember the Pinochet thing, where he came over here after his retirement and moved next door to Bruce Forsyth on a golf club. And there was an attempt to extradite him, and that went all the way, obviously, to the House of Lords, as it was then. And Lord Hoffman, he was sitting on that particular panel, but an objection was taken that because his wife is a secretary at Amnesty International, and Amnesty International obviously had lots to say about Pinochet and indeed had submitted some arguments and evidence on behalf of the government side to try and get the extradition. They said, well, no, that creates an appearance of bias. Now, what's interesting there is Pinochet himself said, I accept that Lord Hoffman is not biased and will give me a fair hearing. However, the court said that, in the same way that Caesar's wife has to be above suspicion, The court here needs to be seen to be squeaky clean. Therefore, we're going to remit this back for a rehearing, and Lord Hoffman will have to stand down. So that's the key case on sort of, judicial, involvement outside the law, their sort of political campaigns, and indeed, like I say, just people they are associated with, because that wasn't even Lord Hoffman, that was just his missus. So yeah, they're the key tests. So, that's the argument about the Garrick Club thing, is that when it comes to actual court cases, what if a judge sits on a court case and he's been, hanging around in the same club as counsel for the, one of the sides, and some people don't have access to that sort of thing. But there's also the argument that if judges are to, rule fairly and without bias against anybody because of any particular characteristic, judges being members of male-only institutions, that presents a problem, not just the appearance of bias, but sort of, in terms of attitude and things like that. I mean, people have compared this and said, well, look, people can be members of the Women's Institute. The argument is, yes, but that's not really the corridors of power. I mean, like I say, when you look at the list of the Garrick, it is like very, very senior members of the judiciary, members of the government, members of the civil service, members of the security and the intelligence services. So that was the argument that, look, come on. I know there's a rule that supposedly there's a rule that says no business is to be conducted on club premises, but people have reported that that's very honoured in the breach, and of course people just end up talking to each other. I mean, I must confess, when I bump into sort of judicial friends, the last thing we actually want to talk about is the law. I mean, sometimes we'll swap amusing stories, but generally speaking, it's like, right, we're off duty now. Can we just go to the bar? But anyway, yeah. So that's what all that fuss is about, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, lots of people are resigning from the Garrick Club. Interestingly, there are two council's opinions already on whether the club's constitution does indeed permit women members, because although everything is written in terms of he in the club constitution, there's that argument that as a standard interpretation of legal documents, unless it's expressly stated, any reference to the masculine includes the feminine. Although then there is another issue in their constitution, because it refers to the club secretary and says he or she. Now the argument is, well, actually when we wrote this, we were actually thinking about letting a lady being our club secretary, so that's why we put in there. And the fact that we've said he or she in that section doesn't mean that it's not he or she in every other section, even though it only says he. So there's one council's opinion's gone that way. There's another council's opinion that's gone the other way, but Lord Panic's just done one, and he's pretty bright. It'll be interesting to see what he says. Of course, they're called opinions. All they are is council saying, well, I think this is what the situation is, but ultimately it would be for the courts to decide if anybody took this further. And that'd be interesting to see who gets to be the judge. Obviously, it'd be quite funny if it was like, a judge who actually was a member of the Garrick Club. But there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting. I suspect we'll get a lot of comments about this. Where am I today? I'm at somewhere called Cake and Ale's Mine, or sometimes Ale and Cakes Mine. I'm never quite sure which way round it goes, but it's very pretty. It was quite a relatively small operation. It wasn't one of the big conglomerates. It was actually just one guy set this up, and apparently he did very, very well out of it. So good luck to him. Oh yeah, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, all that sort of nonsense.